minds of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, February 1st, 2024. My name is Emma Vigeland in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Dr. Uche Blackstock, author of Legacy, A Black Physician Reckons with Racism in Medicine, and later in the show, Ken Klippenstein on secret troops, potentially, being stationed in the Middle East. Meanwhile, South Africa says Israel is already violating the ICJ's order to prevent more deaths, and hints at formally accusing other nations with complicity. A U.S. court dismisses a lawsuit filed against Biden by Palestinian Americans, citing jurisdiction, but does conclude Israel is plausibly committing genocide. Negotiations continue on a temporary ceasefire paired with hostages being released. The death toll in Gaza is 27,000 at minimum. Biden to issue an executive order sanctioning Israeli settlers, but shies away from doing the same, despite reportedly considering it, to extremist cabinet officials in Israel. Iran says it doesn't want war. Let's hope. Chicago becomes the largest U.S. city to call for a ceasefire. Polls find people feel the economy's improving, but it's not translating to Biden's approval rating. And despite consistent cooling inflation, the Fed keeps rates steady, despite criticism. The House passes its corporate tax break and child tax credit bill along bipartisan lines, or I guess not along partisan lines, but Senate Republicans are reluctant to give Biden a win. Momentum grows for Congress to address out-of-control housing prices. Over 30% of Hyundai workers at an Alabama plant have already joined the UAW amid a historic drive. Pro-Trump megadonor Timothy Mellon pours money into RFK's presidential bid. And lastly, satellite images reveal vast secret prison facilities being built in Myanmar amid a crackdown on pro-democracy protests. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It is an EmMajority Report Thursday. It is also the first day of Black History Month. So looking forward to speaking about Black history throughout February and kicking it off with a conversation with Dr. Uche Blackstock, who is a physician and a health equity advocate, who will speak to us about the legacy and continued persistent medical racism in this country. But let's start here because Euromed Monitor, their system of tallying death tolls in Gaza is it's higher than what you'll see reported in the press, because when you see 27,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, that's basically who they can confirm. There are thousands more missing, trapped under rubble, and tens of thousands more who are permanently maimed, disabled, paralyzed, without limbs from Israel's unprecedented bloody assault on Gaza. But Euromed Monitor is reporting that since the ICJ ruling, the Israeli army has killed over 373 Palestinians, hundreds more injured, and that is in defiance of the ICJ essentially issuing a cease, not a ceasefire, right? But effectively a ceasefire and everything that they laid out. We spoke about this before, but I think the ICJ was probably hesitant to use the word ceasefire because, one, Hamas is not a party under the Genocide Convention, so they felt they don't have jurisdiction, and two, because it would clearly not be able to be enforced, really, and then that further undercuts the legitimacy of the scope of the court when they rule specifically on the genocide accusation. So I was...
And also it implies there's some sort of like... And this is not to undermine the general call for ceasefire, right, but in this context, like it's sort of like two co-belligerents.
Exactly.
And actually it's one community ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, the ceasefire phrase, right? Like, I'm going to take it because that's what we've coalesced behind to stop the killing. But yeah, I'm in agreement with you that it's not really appropriate for this genocide.
Well, there's always another demand behind it, which is like the occupation is a problem as well. Right?
Exactly, right. It reinforces the false notion that this is a two-sided conflict between two sovereign parties. But you know, the world is watching, right? Like the ICJ ruling that was issued to Israel, basically saying you have to stop these things. Euromed Monitor is reporting they're in violation of it. It's clear that they're in violation of it since the ruling. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir has called for the resettlement of Gaza, so an explicit call for ethnic cleansing by the National Security Minister. Israelis, right-wing, nationalist, pro-genocide protesters are blocking aid trucks from coming into Gaza. A mass grave was found with decomposing bodies. Palestinians, dozens in black bags, blindfolded and handcuffed, dead in northern Gaza. That was discovered the other day. So these are just more and more crimes that are being documented, I think, by the South African legal team and by the world, as Israel was supposed to cease these kinds of crimes, and they clearly have not.
No, instead we just decided to back them up, or like the West decided to back them up by going after UNRWA.
Yeah, right.
UNRWA.
And completely giving into the Israeli government's obvious distraction effort on the day that the ICJ issued its ruling. This is when they were making the accusations about UNRWA really being Hamas. But this is South Africa's Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor. She has been leading the efforts and has been the most vocal representative of South Africa's case here. And I commend her immensely. She was speaking at, I guess, a press conference yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, Bradley. Speaking at a press conference in South Africa yesterday about a bunch of issues, but including the South Africa leading the charge against Israel in the ICJ. And here she basically kind of hints at the fact that South Africa may be considering deeming nations supporting Israel right now, the United States, the UK, Germany, complicit in these crimes.
What do we expect on support from other countries? We expect them to join, to submit papers formally to the ICJ to say, I don't know, is it a friend of the what?
As an
intervening party. This is what we are hoping countries will do. I have some that have confirmed to me, but I don't want to name them until the formal step is taken, because I'd like to see the formal step. So we are waiting on that. And then I think we will also be approaching fellow countries, especially in NAM and G77, about the relief agency and what we should continue doing to support. Then, yes, indeed, Ms. Masamo, I can't be dishonest. I believe that the rulings of the court have been ignored by Israel Hundreds of people have been killed in the last 3-4 days. And clearly Israel believes it has license to do as it wishes. So the world does have to reflect, because we're going to come to a point where we have to think, what do we do to stop such acts occurring, not just with Israel, but any party in the world. We know that we were unable to protect Rwandan citizens when they faced a massive slaughter and a genocide. We are allowing this to happen again right before our eyes on TV screens. South Africa has taken the bold step of approaching the ICJ. We succeeded with the provisional measures application. I think we now have to look at proposing other measures to the global community, but also securing international solidarity on this matter in support of the Palestinian people. And remember that what we seek is a two-state solution. We believe Israel must exist.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, we reversed the order a little bit of this. It's okay. Don't worry about it. That was the part that where Pandor basically said that she does not believe that Israel is abiding by the ICJ cease and desist, stop doing these crimes. You have to take these measures in order to be in compliance with the International Court of Justice. This was the part closer to the beginning of her press conference where she called on nations to halt support to Israel.
The court did not grant this provisional measure. The decision overall by the court marks, we believe, a decisive victory for international law and a significant milestone in the search for justice for the people of Palestine. It also affirms the importance of global governance institutions, including organs of the United Nations. It remains vital for us as member states to ensure that we respect and implement the decisions of the court. And I suppose what confronts us now is, what do we do if there is no implementation? And that is the question all nations must answer today, because it is a body of the United Nations that has set out these provisional measures. It's not the South African government or South Africa on its own. It is the International Court of Justice. And if its orders are not respected, what does this mean for every other government that commits atrocities against a people? This is the big question that confronts us as the global community today. The finding, we think, also makes it clear that it is plausible that genocide is taking place against the Palestinian people in Gaza. You would have heard the court's president actually saying this. Third states must therefore also act independently and immediately to prevent genocide by Israel and to ensure that they, as third states, are not themselves involved in violation of the Genocide Convention by aiding or assisting in the commission of genocide. This necessarily imposes an obligation on all states to cease funding and facilitating Israel's military actions, which, as the court has indicated, are plausibly genocidal.
So that's that there. I think that that is a notable statement by her there. One, I mean, her saying later in that press conference, that was about an hour after she said these initial opening statements, basically saying, I believe Israel is in violation of what the ICJ said that they need to be doing. That means that, I mean, I am in total agreement with that, obviously, but that only strengthens South Africa's case, as acts with genocidal intent are alleged to have been perpetrated after the court ruled in the way that it did. And then there, she's treating it with a lot of deftness, but she's implicating the United States in complicity and genocide right there.
Yeah. And hopefully people face justice for that.
Look, these are these international court systems. They're severely limited, and we understand this, right? And there's no silver bullet that's going to end. I don't even want to use the word bullet, but you understand what I'm saying. There's nothing that's gonna immediately fix and sew up the wounds of this campaign of mass killing and the 75 plus years of displacement and occupation and ethnic cleansing that preceded it. I mean, it's going to take a ton of reconciliation, and hopefully the United States will eventually realize it's not in our national interest to continue to prop up this pariah state, and we play a part in that down the line. I mean, that's hope against hope. But this kind of international pressure, where Biden's legacy will be one with complicity potentially in genocide, is another just kind of brick by brick building of a case that will resound throughout history. And
it's where we have to move next. The ceasefire demand, is one thing, but we've been hearing this for months now. The calls for whether the world courts can act on it is one thing, but elaborating it to say that this is not being done in our name. I think more efforts and the more way people can elaborate that is important.
Yes. Lastly on this, the limitations of these court systems are in part because they were created in the structure of colonialism and white Western imperialism and Anglo-Saxon Western dominance, in the same way that's how the United Nations was crafted. The ICJ is a better body, but there will be those limitations there, of course. The value of it, though, is as a pressure mechanism. And I do hope, though, because of the renewed focus on this and the need for an international-based rules order, that the legitimacy of international law gets some new life in the wake of this. But perhaps that's hope against hope. We shall see. Thank you again to South Africa for their continued efforts on this front. Before we get to our next guest, Dr. Uche Blackstock, we have a word from one of our sponsors, ExpressVPN. Did you notice that big tech companies today are masquerading as privacy companies? Just fix your settings. Privacy settings, turn off app tracking, and you're all good. Right. Are we supposed to believe that the big bad tech wolf is now turned into our sweet grandma? And it's why wouldn't they just not have those settings if they don't want to spy on you? It's bizarre. Big tech literally feeds on your information. Sure, maybe they'll release a feature now and then that does some good, but collecting and selling off your data is in big tech's nature. It's their product. They can't stop themselves from looking at what you do online. The better to help yourself, protect yourself better against big tech's prying eyes, you've got to use ExpressVPN. It is what I use. Visit expressvpn.com/majority, and you can get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. When you use ExpressVPN on your computer or phone through their app, you're hiding your unique IP address. Websites can't use that address to find out your real location or track what you do online. And on top of that, ExpressVPN encrypts and reroutes 100% of your online activity, so your internet provider, Wi-Fi admin, and hackers cannot see it. The best part, though, is how easy it is to use. It just takes one click to protect all of your devices. One ExpressVPN subscription covers up to 5 devices at the same time, so you can protect your entire family, too. That's why ExpressVPN is rated #1 by CNET, Wired, Tech Radar, and countless others. So today is the day. Get the VPN that I trust to protect my online privacy when big bad tech is at the door. Visit expressvpn.com/majority, and you can get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/majority, expressvpn.com/majority. majority, expressvpn.com/majority to learn more. All right, folks, quick break, and we'll be right back. We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Uche Blackstock, physician, founder and CEO of Advancing Health Equity, and author of Legacy, A Black Physician Reckons with Racism in Medicine. Dr. Blackstock, thanks so much for coming on this program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. I mean, today's the first day of Black History Month, so it's great to have you on to talk about this ever-pressing issue of these massive disparities in healthcare and health equity along racial lines that are as persistent as any piece of systemic racism in this country. And I want to get to that in a second, but your book also has so much of your personal experience embedded into it that I think is really important for people to understand the legacy of your mother, the work that you and your sister do, and how that kind of informs why you felt so inspired to do this kind of work. If you don't mind talking a bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. The name of the book, Legacy, actually, has a double meaning, as you allude to. It's, the legacy of being a second generation Black woman physician. My mother, my twin sister Oni, and I are the first Black mother-daughter legacy from Harvard Medical School. And that was that happened in 2005. So, we're still making history in ways that, we can celebrate, but also seem a little bit inexcusable. But my mother was born here in central Brooklyn, where I live now, under very different circumstances. She was born to a single mom on public assistance. They moved around a lot, but my mother was very, very curious and had a strong work ethic, and was lucky enough to be the first person in her family to go to college, and had a chemistry professor there who encouraged her to apply to medical school, which was something she hadn't really thought about. And so she applied to medical school, got into all of her medical schools, and ended up matriculating at Harvard Medical School, where she obviously felt like a fish out of water. There were kids in her class whose parents had written some of the textbooks they were using. But one of the things about my mom is that, she could have gone anywhere after Harvard Medical School, but she came back to New York City. She trained at Harlem Hospital, and then she ended up practicing in the very same neighborhood that she grew up in central Brooklyn, caring for her family and neighbors. And so that was a huge lesson that my sister and I learned from her, is that, you go to these prestigious institutions and you come back and you work in service to your community. So the work that my sister and I are doing now, the health equity advocacy work, we both have consulting firms where we work with healthcare organizations around bias and racism in healthcare to close the gap in racial health inequities. But really that legacy is continuing the work that my mother started, when we were younger, where she would work with other Black physicians to organize community health fairs and connect patients to the services that they needed. Then it didn't have this sexy term health equity, but she was doing health equity work, and she was really looking at her patients in a way where she was thinking about the social and political context in which they lived, worked, loved, and prayed. And so that's the kind of holistic way I think about how we should care about our patients.
And your mother sadly passed away from leukemia in her late 40s. What was that experience like for you? Of course, it's completely tragic, but to go through that kind of intense medical crisis as you and your sister and your mother have this kind of heightened awareness of what it means to be a Black woman getting this kind of care in America.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We were 18 years old when she was diagnosed with acute myelogenous leukemia, and she really, she took such great care of herself. It really was a shock. She was only 46 when she was diagnosed and 47 when she died, a year older than I am right now. But at the time, I was so young, I didn't even really understand, kind of like the risk factors that she had, that the fact that as a Black woman, the kind of leukemia she developed was very, very rare. And it really was as a practicing physician that I started really kind of relearning sort of all the educational gaps in my my training. And I did some research for the book, that my mom grew up in neighborhoods in central Brooklyn that were Superfund sites, that there was, toxic dumping. And when my mother was getting treated, we went and got a second opinion at Dana-Farber Institute in Boston. And they told her it looked like from her chromosomes, she had been exposed to radiation at some point early in her life. And so that's what I write about in Legacy, that, there was a chance that my mother was exposed to radiation because, she lived in poverty in these neighborhoods where, toxic dumping and exposures happened. And that could have been implicated in why she was so young when she was diagnosed with this disease and ended up dying prematurely.
And I mean, the the environmental racism aspect of it, I want to get to as well, because that's so key to understanding many of these current kind of racial disparities. I mean, Flint, Michigan obviously comes to mind, but there are countless Flint, Michigans across the country, and Superfund sites, and all of those things that you discussed there. But something that really struck me in your book was that the percentage of Black physicians was actually higher in 1910 than it was in 2008. Nearly 100 years later, when this was tallied. And you talk a bit about this thing called the Flexner Report in 1910, which seems very much at the root of this very low percentage of Black physicians in this country. Talk a bit about what that was and how
Sure.
we're still living with that.
Yeah, and I should just give context. Like growing up, I thought most physicians were Black because that's who I was surrounded by when I was younger. By my mom, by my pediatrician, all of the women physicians that she worked with in the local organization. And so when I got older, I was like, wait a minute, our percentage is really that low. And it really was as a practicing physician, again, that I was on this journey of trying to unlearn and learn those educational gaps. And so one of the, discoveries that I made was this Flexner report that actually was, commissioned by the American Medical Association, which is one of the oldest and largest organizations of physicians and has its own kind of horrific history with bias and racism, and the Carnegie Mellon Foundation. So they commissioned an education specialist named Abraham Flexner, who also in his writings had very, very racist ideas about Black people and Black students. But they commissioned him to go around to the 155 medical schools in the United States and Canada, and to hold them up to the standards of Western European medical schools, and in the US, specifically to Johns Hopkins. At that time, there were 7 historically Black medical schools, but this report led to the closure of 5 of them, leaving behind Howard and Meharry medical schools, which are still open to this day. But obviously, because of the legacy of racism, of generational wealth, those Black medical schools did not have the resources, did not have the equipment, did not have all of the criteria that were needed to fulfill these recommendations that Flexner put out. And so it was interesting. In 2020, there was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that calculated and estimated how many physicians those Black medical schools, those 5 schools that were closed, would have trained. They estimated that between 25,000 and 35,000 Black physicians would have been trained in those medicals had they remained open. And when I read that, I cried. I cried because I thought, what a tremendous loss to our communities, what a tremendous loss to our patients, the hundreds of thousands or millions of patients those physicians would have treated, the students and trainees they would have mentored, the research that would have been done in Black health. And so I thought it really was important for people who read Legacy. It's really for a broad audience to understand why in 2024, even today, why the numbers of Black physicians are so low. And it has a lot to do with the Flexner report. I also should add that, the recent SCOTUS decision on race-conscious admissions, I think could have a very similar ripple effect as the Flexner report, because it will impact, the diversity of who's admitted to pre-med programs, to medical schools. So I think unless these academic institutions try to find ways to make sure they maintain a diverse student body, we may see a similar impact from the recent SCOTUS decision on Black health and Black communities.
What were some of the reasons that the Flexner report gave for shutting down these medical schools?
Right. So essentially, there were a few areas that they said all medical schools should have a certain standard for. So admissions criteria, like certain types of laboratories, certain numbers of physician scientists as faculty. Obviously, Black medical schools,
right.
probably, didn't have a lot of physician scientists or laboratories. And I think that to use the same standards for them as predominantly white institutions that had a totally different set of or amount of wealth and resources was unreasonable. But he suggested that Black medical schools were putting out underperforming, physicians and medical students. But he was using these very stringent criteria that I don't think was necessarily fair to compare Black medical schools to, and doesn't necessarily mean that those schools were indeed putting out poorly qualified physicians. I will say even now, medical schools go by, use MCAT scores and GPAs, and we know that, the MCAT, which is the exam you take for to get into medical schools, that is impacted by socioeconomic status. If you are right,
course.
So if you're, right.
Yeah.
So if and that doesn't necessarily predict if you're going to be a good doctor, right? So there's so many other ways that you can predict or encourage, people to be good physicians that don't necessarily, rely on scores and MCAT scores or GPAs. We need a really more holistic idea of what it is to be a good physician, because we actually already see that if schools are using these standards, why do we still have these racial health inequities today, right? You would think everyone would be getting the best care.
Let alone the fact that going to medical school, if you don't have the money, you're going hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt immediately. And then
absolutely
the compounding effects of that are, okay, so the kind of advocacy that you do, right? Maybe if you're a Black medical student who's in that amount of debt, or just a medical student who's in that amount of debt, and you want to be more community focused, you're probably going to go to a more high paying job to pay off your debt. And then there's this brain drain in poorer communities.
Exactly. And we see that already. We see that in specialties like primary care for adult and pediatrics, because of our current, for-profit health insurance system that reimburses primary care physicians at a lower rate. And so we have a lot of medical students going into subspecialties like dermatology or plastic surgery or orthopedic surgery, where they can get compensated more. They're able to pay their loans back. And so there are some medical schools that are becoming tuition free or giving grants to students. And I think that really the obligation of medical schools really should be to prepare physicians to take care of a diverse patient population and to work in underserved communities. So there should be incentives given to students to work in, marginalized and underserved communities, like many Black communities in this country. And there simply are not, there are some, loan repayment programs through the federal government, but I think it's up to private institutions also to make sure that they are training medical students to work in those communities, as well as applying for primary care and primary pediatrics, geriatric specialties.
Right. And the other piece that I also want to touch on as well is the fact that, on its face, you could maybe draw some more simplistic conclusions about Black medical care because of just socioeconomic status, right? Because there is this massive wealth gap that has persisted for so many years or centuries and decades, that is the sole root. But you cite a bunch of really high profile examples, the most recent one being Serena Williams, speaking about how she was not taken seriously when she had symptoms that were I think like her previous blood clot during her pregnancy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
yeah.
correct.
And she was calling attention to this, and she almost died in her pregnancy because of that. And she has so many resources. She's a millionaire. She's one of the greatest athletes in the world. So it's not just socioeconomic status. It's also just like Black pain's not taken as seriously, and Black female pain is not taken that seriously.
Yeah, no, exactly. One thing I always quote is like this idea that, here I am as a Black woman physician with a Harvard undergrad degree, a Harvard med school degree, but I'm still 5 times more likely than my white peers to die of pregnancy-related complications. And you would say, okay, wait, so why is that? Like, why is that the case? I have access to, insurance. I should have access to quality care. But the other piece of it, in addition to how racism impacts what we call the social determinants of health, like housing, education, just basically depriving communities of resources that ultimately impacts health. The other part of it is what happens when Black patients interface with the healthcare system and health professionals. And this idea that it really doesn't matter what your socioeconomic status is that, often our concerns are minimized or ignored or dismissed. And so we see that actually a lot, regardless of socioeconomic status. And, I think most health professionals would like to say, no, I treat all my patients well. I treat them all the same. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that really is not the case. That exactly, you mentioned this whole issue of pain and pain inequity, and that how often, there was a study in 2016 out of UVA that showed that medical students and residents with 2 mock cases, the only difference was the race of the patient. They consistently scored the Black patient's pain lower and gave the patient less pain medication. So that's 2016. So I always say in the book, because there's a lot of history in it, a lot of these myths about Black people being biologically different, not feeling pain, are deeply rooted in the history of our country's racism, Jim Crow, and it persists today in our healthcare system.
I cite that exact example a lot because it's the one that sticks in my mind. I believe that study also in that survey of those medical students found these really racist tropes that they still like, that Black skin is thicker than white skin, for example.
Yes, I know. Yeah, I was like, I didn't want to answer your question too long, but yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. So the authors like made up these myths, right? Yeah, like Black people's skin are less sensitive to pain, or Black skin is thicker. So and they found that those medical residents and medical students who were more likely to believe in those false myths were the same ones who were more likely to score the Black patient's pain lower and undertreat the Black patient's pain. So I like to say this, that like health professionals are no different than anyone else who lives in our country, that they are also absorbing this cultural messaging that we have all around us in the media, in books, in all different places about anti-Blackness and how Black people are somehow different. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, that actually impacts how we are caring for patients.
Right. I mean, it's amazing, and how that myth, how those same folks, medical students, despite going to undergrad, having this understanding, they buy into that, and you just show how deeply rooted it is.
Right. And can I add one thing?
Yeah.
So, I talk about in medical school, like explicitly or implicitly, sometimes, we're taught that there are differences. Like for a long time, there was a race correction factor that was associated with kidney function. There was a different set of normal values for Black patients and non-Black patients. Like if you go into the electronic medical record system, you would see different ranges. And that was based on old myths that Black people had more muscle mass, and that correlated with a different set of kidney function. And so actually what that led to is actually Black patients having a delay in being referred to for specialty kidney care and being placed on transplant lists. So that race correction factor, a lot of kidney groups have been working towards getting rid of that. But we see how, these differences based on these myths actually end up harming Black patients.
And it essentially boils down to race essentialism, right? It's
exactly
this idea that people are inherently different biologically in some way based on race. I'm wondering how you feel and I don't have the knowledge really to go to make an assertion here, so I'm going to ask for your expertise on sickle cell, because there's a real lack of research and treatment, is my understanding, for sickle cell, or an analysis into the potential connection with past instances of malaria. That's something I had read previously, but I'm curious what your take is on that kind of debate.
Oh, sure. And I think I would preface this by saying, like, when we see these poor health outcomes, even among patients with sickle cell disease, really what they are it's the impact of racism, right, through practices and policies, and not race. So, for example, with sickle cell disease, even it's a gene, it's an inherited disease, right? So it's based on a gene. So it has, there's geographical ancestry related to it. It's not race. And one thing I talk about in the book is that there are people from all over the world that have sickle cell disease. A lot of them are from sub-Saharan Africa, but a lot of them from the Mediterranean, from India, also have the sickle cell gene. And the issue is that in the United States, most people with sickle cell disease are Black. Right. So 100,000 Black people in the United States have sickle cell disease. And so because of that, it's been racialized as a Black disease. So even though the disease it's been discovered over 100 years ago, and yes, it does have a protective factor for malaria. Like, there's a reason why people in those different parts of the country, I'm sorry, of the world rather, have this inherited gene. It's supposed to be protective against developing malaria. But at the same time, because it's been racialized as a Black disease, in the United States, we have seen a lack of research into therapeutics, lack of funding going into developing sickle cell centers of excellence, like we have for other inherited diseases like hemophilia or cystic fibrosis, which primarily affect people who are racialized as white. And so because of that, we see a lot of patients with sickle cell disease coming to the emergency department because there is not a system in place to care for them appropriately, so that to prevent these ER visits, we see them in the ER. And what happens is they get stigmatized. They come in with pain crises and they get stigmatized as drug seekers, like they're seeking pain medication, and they get characterized as people who are, you have to be suspicious of, who are just there because they're addicted to pain medication. And really, what it's a result of we don't have a system in place outside of the ER because of the lack of funding to care for these patients. And so it's like almost like it's compounded. It's like these issues are compounded on each other, and so. That's the experience. I talk about this patient I had with sickle cell disease in my book, who just, came to the ER so often. And we saw so many patients like that in my residency, which is based in a mostly low income, working class Black neighborhood.
And the lack of preventative care is also going to compound anything else that comes up. And
exactly.
I guess that brings me kind of to where I wanted to conclude, which is maybe our most recent example of extreme medical racism and lack of care for Black people in this country, which was the COVID pandemic, and who bore the brunt of the pandemic, who was asked to make sacrifices to keep the economy going and who was not. Right. I know that was a big part of your inspiration for the book. If you could talk a bit about that, your experience as a doctor during that time.
Yes, absolutely. I had made kind of a career transition at that time. I moved from ER to urgent care in January of 2020. And then March happened, and I was, working in Brooklyn, New York, in the epicenter. And I was at an urgent care where we saw a very racially diverse patient population, but literally within days, I saw a quick shift in who I was caring for, mostly essential workers, service workers, mostly Black people and people of color. Most of my white patients I did not see. Many of my patients worked for the MTA, the subway and bus service. They were coming in with COVID symptoms. And I remember thinking, even before the pandemic hit New York City, seeing the risk factors of high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, asthma as risk factors for people who do worse when they get COVID, I said, I'm so worried about our communities because I know our communities carry a higher burden of those chronic disease because of systemic racism. And so I actually wrote an op-ed before the end of March about what I was concerned was going to happen. And of course, it did happen, but it just kind of exposed already the very deep fissures that we have within our healthcare system as it relates to access to healthcare, as it relates to, employment. Like, we know that people in essential jobs or as service workers, low paying jobs, were more likely to be interfacing with the public and exposed to the virus, and also less likely to have employer-sponsored, especially service workers, employer-sponsored healthcare. So again, even more at risk. We know that people of color were more likely to live in multi-generational housing. Again, more at risk, more likely to take public transportation. So I thought it was really it was very unfortunate, though, but to show like this how the pandemic really to use it to connect the dots to show how systemic racism impacts those social determinants of health and leaves our communities so much more vulnerable for when a pandemic hits.
We had Garrett S. wrote in, as a pediatrician listening during my lunch, I love this interview. I'm trying to messaging with some of these same points, but Dr. Blackstock keeps beating me to it. Bravo. So that's
Thank you.
One of the messages from a fellow doctor. Dr. Blackstock, I really appreciate your time today. We will put a link to your book, which is called Legacy, A Black Physician Reckons with Racism in Medicine, in the description wherever you're listening to this or watching, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions.
Oh, thank you. All right. With that, we are going to go to our second guest, friend of the show, Ken Klippenstein. We'll be talking about why do we have all these troops in the Middle East right now? It's a little bit scary. Be right back. We are back, and we are joined by Ken Klippenstein, friend of the Ken Klippenstein. I don't know why I put a D on the end of there. Friend of the show, investigative reporter who focuses on national security at The Intercept. Ken, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing all right. The world is not, but I'm doing okay.
Yeah, it's not going great. So Biden's saying publicly that he does not want a wider war in the Middle East. Iran said that today as well. And yet, the United States' true presence in the Middle East and the extent of it is not widely known. You have two pieces that came out within the last week on this very topic. Let's just start there broadly about why there is such a lack of public information about the true extent of our troop presence in the region, as Israel, in my opinion, is committing a genocide, and the escalating tensions and potentially a region-wide conflict, like the threat of that looms very greatly.
Yeah, Israel's conduct and its relative unpopularity internationally is directly connected to the lack of transparency and disclosure around the presence of U.S. troops. So to take a country like Jordan, just to give you an example, where 3 U.S. service members were killed on Sunday by a drone attack from Iran-affiliated militias, or Iran-backed militias, I should say. The reason a lot of people responded to that saying, wait, we have troops in Jordan? Now, national security reporters like myself, people in the military, it's an open secret that we have troops in Jordan. It's pretty well understood. Now, why don't ordinary people know it? Because the government doesn't advertise it very much. They don't like to acknowledge it. The reason for that is host nation sensitivities. The Jordanians don't like that the U.S. is present because they don't like the conduct of Israel. They don't like the U.S. support for it. Jordan is, home to millions of Palestinian citizens and refugees, And so for that reason, they don't talk about the size of the U.S. presence. In fact, they try to keep the bases to a certain size so that there's not a big enough footprint that people notice it. And that's just one country. U.S. troops are in virtually every country in the Middle East, with the exception, I think, of Iran and Lebanon. And the government doesn't talk about it. And so when we, the public, find out about it, unfortunately, is when they're killed. And then that's when people find out about the nature of our foreign policy. So I think you get to a really important point here where the White House, the Biden administration, keeps messaging, we don't want a regional war. But if you look at its actions, strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, no sign of a reduced support for Israel amid its war that obviously Iran has and the rest of the region have a stake in, the actions don't seem to match the rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, it's the arrogance, really, of the United States and the fact that, we feel quite entitled to have a true presence in the region, that we would not in any way abide if there were Iranian troops, say in Mexico or something to that effect, or in Cuba or right off the coast of the country. Like, that would be such a provocation, or considered such a provocation by our government, that we would probably go to war over that. I mean, but it's just implied that the United States should be stationed in these countries and have this kind of omnipresent military force in the region. Like, what is, for example, the Jordanian king and other leaders that rule over these nations? What's their position on U.S. military presence in the country? I mean, has it, like, for Sisi is one of the top recipients of military aid, of U.S. foreign aid, like in Egypt, right? And so that seems like a little bit of a quid pro quo relationship. Exactly. But what's it like in other countries in the region?
Yeah, these regimes are kind of two-faced because they have to message to their public, we don't like the Americans, we don't like the Americans, we don't like the Americans. While on the other hand, taking huge amounts of our military aid in order to stay in power within their countries, because let's remember, these are very authoritarian regimes. In the case of Jordan, their leadership very harshly criticizing the U.S. support for the Israel-Hamas war, while at the same time hosting the troops, hosting F-16s, F-15s that we surged to the region after the October 7th attack, while at the same time telling his public, I actually don't like the Americans, what they're doing is really bad, so on and so forth. So there's kind of a disjunct between the rhetoric and their conduct, and the U.S. government goes to great lengths to be able to conceal the nature of that contradiction and to keep as quiet as possible. So when the New York Times reports that the U.S. is surging troops to Jordan, like I just said, they don't say Jordan, they say they have moved assets to the region. And that's out of deference to the White House, because they know it. If I know it, their national security reporters know it. They're not telling the public it because they don't want to piss off the White House. And the consequence of that is the public doesn't know basic facts about what our foreign policy is.
And they probably didn't know. Why were there troops in Jordan anyway, right? Who were able to be killed, 3 U.S. soldiers killed by a drone strike, which is prompting the White House responding in some kind of way to Iran. The Washington PR line is, they're there at the invitation of the governments. But again, these are authoritarian regimes. The public's attitude and what they want is not generally heeded by their leadership unless it's completely overwhelming people on the streets. So it doesn't mean much to say that some dictator said, okay, yeah, the U.S. can come here if you give me weapons. That's not the same as if, Norway hosts U.S. troops because they have a democracy. So it's just different. Yeah. I mean, like, you read numbers of something, well over 90% of people in Saudi Arabia support the Palestinian people. And so, like, MBS has to publicly say, I do, and gesture towards it, while you see reporting that, the Biden administration is essentially continuing the Abraham Accords and sees this as a viable strategy forward, which was a widely maligned Trump administration initiative that led to the October 7th attack, was one of the impetuses by normalizing relations, or working to do so, between Israel and Saudi Arabia without including the Palestinian people in it whatsoever. So, like, the Saudi Arabia is a great example of talking out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to supporting Palestinians. And so there really is not any powerful regional actor that has the ability to be a counterweight to the U.S. and Israel to support the Palestinian people.
Yeah, we haven't seen a relatively independent figure in that region since like the Nasser regime of Egypt. And so we're really seeing a situation in which, we have these authoritarian governments that are wholly unresponsive, not just to their people, but the wishes of the region. And so, we're in a situation where, to shore up their own power because they're so deeply unpopular and illegitimate, U.S. military support and weapons. And, what we get in exchange for that is the ability to host troops in those countries. And not just the White House, but along with the help of the national media in not disclosing where any of this is happening. That was another piece I reported on, the fact that the White House notified Congress that we have a troop presence in Yemen. Do you hear any of that in the media? Nobody talks about it. There's no discussion of any of it. As we're striking targets there and things are escalating very quickly, these 3 people that got killed in Jordan, the people that took credit for the attack said that it was because of Israel-Hamas conflict and the U.S.'s support for it. So the likelihood of that happening somewhere else like Yemen is going to increase, and there's no discussion of this at all.
Yeah, your reporting on Yemen talks about that, how basically the Pentagon just said, a spokesperson said, that they are not aware of U.S. forces on the ground. But in a December report from the White House, it says that there are U.S. troops on the ground. Talk about that contradiction and how two parts of the federal government can say opposing things at once or within weeks of one another, or to months of one another to the public.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to take more seriously the White House report because that's done under the War Powers Act. They are required to inform Congress. I mean, this is like a basic constitutional matter to inform Congress when we have combat troops in, whatever country and what the purpose of that is. And if you read that report, they acknowledge that, yes, there's a small number of military in Yemen to fight terror groups, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as one example. But in the context of all this, the Biden administration has made clear that they are going to add the Houthis to the terror list. So the question becomes, the reason I did that story is, if they're going to add the Houthis to that list and we're striking the Houthis, are the troops that the White House told in December, this wasn't a report from years ago, this is a report from several weeks ago, that we have troops in country, are they going to be fighting the Houthis that are going to be added to the terror list along with the other terror targets that we know that they're already focused on? And I was a little astonished at how little discussion there is around any of this. All it's about is the Red Sea, which is obviously important. I understand why we're focused on that, but that's not the only thing. And so when the press secretary gets up and says, I'm not aware of any, that's not saying no. That's saying, maybe he hasn't seen the report or whatever it is. It could be a non-denial. They can play all kinds of games with language. They can say, special operations, SEAL Team 6, that's technically under a CIA task force, so it's not actually military. It could be that. I don't know. But what we know is that the White House, again, under that constitutional requirement that they notify Congress, said that in, I think, late December, that we had troops there in the middle of all of this. And I can hardly find any discussion of it. What is their role now? Has that changed since the Israel-Hamas war?
Yeah. And the United States has conducted a good amount of strikes on Houthi targets over the past month. This is over the Houthis and the Houthis who now basically control the north of Yemen, striking these and blockading commercial ships going through the Red Sea in support of the Palestinian people. And they've been explicit that if there's a ceasefire, the attacks will stop. They mostly halted during the initial humanitarian pause. But it is, I think striking to me how they've been quite explicit about why they're doing this. And yet the way the Western press reports on the Houthis in this way, it's as if they're irrational terrorists, and yet the United States is the rational actor. Arab people in the region don't have the luxury of being portrayed as rational.
It really shows how absurd the White House line, too, that this is all contained to Israel-Gaza. It hasn't spread beyond the Israeli territory. It's just ridiculous. I mean, so again, I just mentioned the 3 U.S. troops that were killed. The people that claim credit for it said it was about Israel-Hamas. So that's one example. Another example is the strikes by the Houthis on ships. The Red Sea is a corridor through which huge amounts of international commerce passes. So that's really important. That's another example. And then another example is just all of the different strikes that haven't yet killed people, but have resulted in traumatic brain injuries, and other. I mean, these are hundreds of troops that have been affected by this just since the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. So there's all kinds of examples of ways connected to that the Israel-Hamas war has spread beyond Israel's borders. And the White House's response is to stick their fingers in their ears and say it's not happening. And it's completely absurd that people go along with it.
The other piece of reporting that you uncovered is that you obtained documentation showing, it was from the Air Force, showing that there are military orders to be on standby to deploy support troops if the United States chooses to use ground troops to support Israel. That is a direct contradiction to the public statements made by Biden. What is some of what you found on this?
Yeah, so the White House National Security spokesman, John Kirby, very early on in the conflict made clear, whatever we do, there's no boots on the ground. Now, within a few days of that, there was a picture of Joe Biden posing with some special operations troops that the White House posted on Instagram, and they immediately had to take it down because special operations troops, that's the really secret squirrel guys that you're supposed to, hide their identities. And so within a couple of days of that, I think it became hard to hide that the U.S. had spec ops in Israel. And so the New York Times came out with a report talking about the commando presence that we had in the country. And since then, we've seen evidence of U.S. drones flying over Gaza. And certainly we've sent, I think, troops in the thousands surged, again, the way the New York Times reports it, to the region. I don't think that they were necessarily sent to Israel, but I think it's clear that some were sent to neighboring countries like Jordan for such an eventuality that the U.S. would have to not just support the conflict, but as this document suggests, maybe even do something on the ground. And so that none of that is to say that the admin has done that or is going to do that, but you don't prepare for things like that unless you think there's some chance, no matter how remote. And yeah, that flies in the face of what the admin has promised, which is no boots on the ground. Period.
It's a scary moment. I can keep up your great reporting on this and keep figuring out what the government's actually doing as they lie to our faces publicly about it. I very much appreciate it. Ken Klippenstein, you can read his reporting over at the Intercept. Let us know what else you have coming down the pike, Ken, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of news for you to cover from a national security perspective in the coming months.
Like I told you off camera, one of these days I'll have good news for you all, just not now.
I mean, do not provide promises that you cannot keep, Ken. That is not kind.
I'll stick my fingers in my ear and say, nope, I did good news. What do you want from me?
Yeah, exactly. Appreciate your time today. Thanks so much. And we'll put a link. Yeah, great to catch up. And we'll put a link to your stories wherever people are listening and watching this in the description.
Thanks, Emma.
All right. Thanks, Ken. With that, we are going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half. The number is 646-257-3920. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning, we had Bronco March talking about Nikki Haley and Ben Fong talking about his new podcast on labor and CIO specifically. And this weekend talking to Chip Gibbons about the ICJ and Nancy Pelosi and some other stuff. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get access to that.
And for ESVN today, Bradley and I will be talking a bit about the games that I was not able to cover on Monday, the conference championship games, how they went down. We'll also talk about some of the hires, Ben Johnson removing himself from consideration, and now the Commanders hiring Dan Quinn. I find that hilarious. YouTube.com/ESVN show today. Do we have Brandon or Binder? And if not, we will see them in the fun half. We do have Binder. Whoa. Like clockwork. We're getting him up on the screen. Brandon will be with us soon. Folks, if you can, please become a member. Join themajorityreport.com. Support our work. Support our work if you can. It would be a great help to us. Keep the lights on. All that good stuff. Binder.
Keep the New York rent paid.
Yeah, right. Jesus Christ. Today rent is due. Binder,
It only gets us 29 days this time.
Jesus.
Hey, it's better than 28, which you get every other
I suppose,
February.
yeah.
That's true. Today this is the leap year, I guess. Binder, what's
Whoa.
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 That's right. slowly encroaching.
There we go.
Hello.
Taking over. What's up, guys? Binder, what's happening on Doomed and Scam Economy?
Sure. So on Doomed this week, I had on David Bixenspan. He is a journalist who covers pro wrestling, and we did a real deep dive, like over 2-hour deep dive into the very many allegations over the years against now former WWE head honcho Vince McMahon, and the overall sort of toxic culture he created in the WWE that has really sort of permeated over pro wrestling as a whole over these very many decades. It's a rough one. It's a rough one. A lot of real disturbing things discussed, but I think it's an interesting look into someone who is best buddies with Donald Trump.
All right, Brandon, what's happening on the discourse?
Well, last week I was able to put out our episode on the expanded Wonkaverse, one of the topics I know people were clamoring for. And this weekend I will have a special guest on the show, someone who's on this show as well. And hopefully everyone will be excited to hear that episode as well.
Ooh, well, can you say who it is? I think I have an idea.
It's Matt Leck.
Oh.
Yeah, we're doing a really a topic that is close to my heart, which is House Hunters, particularly House Hunters International.
Oh.
Is what I'll be speaking.
Oh yeah,
about.
I like to think that there's room for every genre of House Hunter on my show, but specifically House Hunters International, I think is most people's favorite. I hope it's most people's favorite.
Yeah, this is just not quite like saying, okay, here's another house in suburban, wherever.
I don't know. I like those because then I just start. I'm like, oh my god, it's like $300,000.
Think of how much farther your money could go.
Bedroom.
I know.
In a,
it's crazy.
I watched a bunch of that actually in my hotel room when I was out in San Francisco. And there was a couple. It was a South Dakota couple that had just moved there. The guy was a basketball coach at a college, and his wife called herself a kindness advocate. And she seemed like a horrible woman. And she just complained the whole time. And I was like, you're not really effectively being a kindness advocate. Yeah. Also, I can just tell you guys are Republicans. I just can tell immediately.
They were buying in South Dakota?
They were he was becoming a basketball coach at a university in South Dakota.
Gotcha.
NS. It was South though. Yeah.
Okay. Just because you advocate for something doesn't mean you live by it yourself.
Yeah, I advocate for being nice all the time.
Yeah,
sometimes I take pot shots from the sidelines, as people say.
I was going to say something really offensive. Then I remembered that I have family members that watch this show, and it was.
I know. I forget that all the time.
Well, I will say I think the House Hunters International, you can ignore the interpersonal drama more and just enjoy the locales. You can just enjoy.
Although sometimes the interpersonal drama does sort of say, are you guys sure you should be moving abroad together? Is there maybe some other things you need to be working through?
Yeah.
Life is short.
Before you buy an apartment downtown.
That question you're asking, Matt. That question you're asking, Matt, is actually the entire crux of the whole 90 Day Fiancé franchise. Are you sure you want to move somewhere with this person?
Yes, but that one makes me sad because those people are very, very lonely.
Yeah,
yes.
Oh yeah. Let's exploit lonely people for television.
That 90 Day Fiancé is intoxicating in the way that only voyeurism really can be.
I understand. It's just I prefer my voyeurism to be rich people with their problems and Real Housewives because the stakes just feel
less
low.
sympathy for them.
Yeah, right. And I could just they're upset about their dog dying at 21 years old and that's a whole episode. That's a little bit
17
easier.
other dogs that they own.
Yeah, right.
Compound that they name.
Yes, yeah. So I 90 Day Fiancé makes me too sad. Anyway, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. And the alpha males are back, 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 back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back, back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back, 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 back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back, 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 back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back, back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Nightmare.
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them, just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them, fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back, 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 back. And the Africans are black, 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 black African. And the alpha males are black, 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 black. And the Africans are back, 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 back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on, fuck them, fuck them. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy.
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back, back. Africans are black, black. Alpha males are black, black. Africans are back, back.
Come on. Come on. Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We are back. It is the fun half, everybody. It is the fun half. Conservative Mind Virus says Robert Evans did an awesome 6-part series on Vince McMahon entitled History's Greatest Monster on Behind the Bastards. Robert also strikes me as a potentially good fun half guest someday. Yeah, I've heard people, I've heard